A very warm welcome at today's second part of our economic summit, which takes place in a digital form today and tomorrow. It's the fourth economic summit we organize to show the economic interests of Baden-Württemberg on a European level, to ask for something and to advertise for our economy. From Brussels, I have a guest. Our guest, Michael Hager. Mr. Hager is the head of cabinet to the Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. I'm very happy that you made it for us today. Currently, the subjects you deal with in the EU are of particular relevance. But I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our guests from Baden-Württemberg who have joined us on account of the special circumstances. They represent more than 500,000 companies here in the heart of Europe. I welcome Mr. Wolfgang Kränke. Mr. Kränke is the president of the Association of Chambers and Commerce and Industry of Baden-Württemberg. I welcome you. Mr. Reichhold, you are the president of the Baden-Württemberg Confederation of Skilled Crafts. I welcome you. Mr. Schneider, you are the president of the Association of Savings Banks in Baden-Württemberg, and I welcome you. Dr. Glaser. Dr. Glaser is the president of the Baden-Württemberg Cooperative Association, and I welcome Mr. Torner, who is the chairman of the Association of German Banks in Baden-Württemberg. With me in the studio is Ms. Hanna Kasper, and she has already moderated our last economic summit and will also guide us through this digital format today. Mr. Hager, ladies and gentlemen, we are now in the second stage of the pandemic, in the mode of easing. At the same time, however, the serious economic consequences of the lockdown are becoming apparent. We already have certain figures for Germany. The Statistics Federal Office said that 2.2% will be the decline in the economic growth for the first quarter, January until March. This sounds very sad. And for all of us, this is a signal. Namely, now we have to take action and we have to think about the future. Disrupted supply chains and the decline in demand at home and abroad are leaving deep scars, especially for many small and medium-sized companies. Now, in this stage, but already, of course, since the beginning of the corona pandemic, securing liquidity is a big challenge. Sales rates in many sectors have massively collapsed. Here there is a big need for action. The state government is doing what it can do to mitigate the consequences of the crisis, to avert waves of insolvencies and mass unemployment. With 2 aid packages, we're taking over 6.5 billion euros into our hands. As the federal state, with our emergency aid program, we have provided small companies without any red tape up to 30,000 euros short term, and we made liquidity available so that the operations can further exist. And soon this program will be expanded. A second immediate aid program will be launched for especially affected industries. But we can see one thing also very clearly. If we want to master this global crisis, across national borders, we have to tackle this and do it together. My concern is therefore to reasonably interlock our regional aid with that of the federal government and the European Union, and that by this we increase a higher value added, and therefore I'm also pleased, which I want to emphasize, that the European Union within the aid framework has given us the necessary scope and will hopefully also continue with this for the months to come, because still we see big need for action. Just think of the big limitations in the field of events, trade shows, and especially also in the area of tourism. It's also always about taxpayers' money, that's for sure. Therefore, together, we should make up our minds how the restricted funds can be used most efficiently and most effectively, and where the greatest benefit can be generated. Therefore, it is my approach to invest specifically in those areas where we see the greatest potentials for growth. That's to say, where we, across German value creation chains, also create the biggest long-term employment effects, because at the end of the day, it's fundamental that jobs are secured in Baden-Württemberg, that we extend the number of jobs so that the people living in Baden-Württemberg have a perspective for the future. Potential, we have plenty of potential in Baden-Württemberg. On the one hand, it's entailed in our small and medium-sized enterprises that play a central role in recovery plans. Therefore, at this point, I also want to advertise for this. On the one hand, after the extreme crisis-related slumps in sales figures, we have to give startup help, also in regulatory terms, because especially SMEs are disproportionately hampered by bureaucratic burdens. On the other hand, we can give them more support in meeting the challenges of digitalization with success. The coronavirus crisis has provided an important impetus here to test digital work processes, the way we do it here in this digital format, but of course it reaches much further, especially in companies which in this phase, in many areas, fall back on digital processes. And I think we have to make use of this moment to be better represented in that. And this economic relaunch with the management of the far-reaching transformation processes should be linked. And in doing so, we can fall back on our existing strengths. The automotive industry secures prosperity and employment throughout the whole of Europe with widely interwoven value chains. Therefore, we need an impetus. We need short-term instruments so that the demand in this leading industry is again boosted. An innovation premium is a possibility here, an innovation premium, which, depending on vehicle emissions, can provide buyers with incentives, including climate protection, and CO2 reduction has to play an important role in that. And such an innovation premium can also be an essential driver in the development, especially to more sustainable mobility in traffic. And in doing so, supporting the restart of the German and European economy. Of course, despite a program of measures, which is non-industry associated, and currently in Germany, we're also talking about easing taxes, tax burdens, and also losses carried forward might be more facilitated to make credit available to companies. And in the year 2020, this will already take an effect, and this will have an effect across the various industries. And nevertheless, in the European Recovery Programme, along with the measures announced yesterday for the funds, these sectors have to be included, and also the leading industries, which are the locomotive here. Also during and after the COVID-19 crisis, climate change and digitalization, also the demographic change, stay a main challenge. And it's a real pleasure for me that so many companies, especially also startup companies, who connect innovative connections. And therefore we need specific investment in innovative ecosystems, in future technologies, which are the basis for sustainable growth and employment. Baden-Württemberg already today can post some progresses, be it for artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hydrogen, e-mobility, or biointelligence and biointelligent systems. Here we are preceding the process as a country. We built up our own competences, quantum computing, together with IBM and Fraunhofer, now in Eningen, and our Cyber Valley, for example, in Tübingen and Stuttgart, where in the field of AI, together with the economy, we do some research. And also for our companies in Baden-Württemberg, we want to be a driving force. We have built the bridge into SMEs via Fraunhofer so that information can flow fast and innovation in products. The research and development that takes place there, that this will be launched on the market into marketable products fast. So we have to, and that's what I claim, our regional activities have to be more strongly interconnected with European activities. And today we will also be talking about that issue, because otherwise, as European Union, as a strong internal market regarding international competition, we can't survive. That's my conviction. We have to set the right tracks, have to give impulses. And Mr. Hager, ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm really excited, and yeah, I think this should be a very interesting exchange. Thank you so much. A strong statement of Madam Minister. Thank you so much, Mrs. Hoffmeister-Kraut. We're also very happy that you are here, dear audience, in the live stream. And also in our second talk of the Economic Summit, Baden-Württemberg and EU, we're again talking with high-ranking representatives of Baden-Württemberg and also from Brussels. And of course, you may also make your input. The audience, please keep your smartphone ready. During the discussion, we will also be asking a question to you and ask you for your mood. And that would be a big pleasure for us. Yeah, yesterday the recovery plan of the European Union was introduced, and this morning with Commissioner Breton we talked about this, and Mr. Hager, you're in the midst of the political happenings. How can the European economy overcome the crisis? What is the EU doing? Thank you so much. Thanks for your invite. I'm very happy to be able to participate in that discussion. Right now, it is important that Baden-Württemberg is present in Europe, and this must be emphasized. And I think with our talks, we'll be succeeding in doing this perfectly. And you just hit the right point of time. For a long time, it had been unclear when our big project, the recovery instrument, will be published. But this works wonderfully. It goes together so well. Partly received figures yesterday, partly today, so quite exciting times. Please allow me to briefly mention this, where the outbreak of the crisis, of course, was a big surprise for all of us, and which originally used to be a Chinese problem, very fast became a shutdown, a lockdown for everyone. Of course, differently happening in different member states, but there were restrictions not just in personal freedom, but also in economic activities. The Commission reacted immediately, and we have seen the measures which were needed in the short run to give support, be it to create more scope. Madam Minister, we already have mentioned the temporary aid programs, which allowed freedom, which hadn't been allowed before, but we also did other things, many things unofficially, apart from the individual aid decisions, and what we called a bank package, to have more freedom temporarily, to create more freedom temporarily, to facilitate lending and the flow of funds into the economy and to secure it. These freedoms for the member states, of course, were also massively used, but were used differently. If you look at the overview of how many aid programs and the number of aid amounts in Germany compared with other member states, there are big differences. And these big differences, just for example, around 50% of the overall authorized aids regard Germany. Secondly comes France, thirdly Italy, then Belgium. But there are also member states such as Spain that played almost no role. Of course, this leads to differences. Of course, there are underlying reasons. Of course, Germany in the last 10 years since the last crisis has been doing great in the economy. You always keep comparing this with fine weather when the time is used to repair the roof of a house. Possibly other member states didn't do it that way. Therefore, Germany has a position which is much better. At the same time, of course, and you mentioned the value creation chains within Europe. Of course, it also doesn't help Germany either. If in other member states, based on that difficult situation, differences exist or ruptures exist and parts of the value creation chain drop out, collapse, go bankrupt. Therefore, with our specific measures, it's important that we give support. There was a first package, the European Stability Mechanism, who was to support member states. The aid we launched for short-time workers, schools in the member states, and thirdly, guarantees to support SMEs and to give them support, liquidity aids to be supplied to overcome this crisis. But there was more than just this. Yesterday, we decided to set up a big package so that the reconstruction phase can be massively supported, namely in various views. On the one hand, of course, grants, allowances, on the other hand, credits. The size we have selected is in line with what we see as needs assessment, so what is really necessary, at least to use the same approach. Of course, we need private allowances, we need the private side who invests, but of course also we need the driver on the side of public spending to overcome the crisis. With that package, we exactly started to work on that. And the fundamental ideas you have seen. So what we need is support, specific support, which on the one hand especially supports member states which were especially hit by the crisis. It's a crisis instrument, so it's not about eliminating structural weaknesses, but it's about solving the crisis and the impact of the crisis to make sure that we especially work on that. At the same time, of course, and you've also mentioned this, and you gave us wonderful examples, where I myself one had the privilege to study quantum technology at the University of Ulm. Baden-Württemberg is a pioneer in many of these areas that you named, and also this shall be sure in the future. This recovery package is not just an operation for now to make sure that companies can survive the crisis, but it's especially also there to prepare Europe for its future. With the different pillars like the Green Deal, green transformation, including CO2 reductions or neutrality. Secondly, digital is a theme, and to also make Europe more resilient. Because the lesson we learned from the crisis is that delivery chains, if they're orientated too much one-sidedly, they might entail difficulties. And we can strengthen this, and I think Monsieur Breton, Commissioner, mentioned this morning. He classified the economic ecosystems in his strategy, which is a good hint to gain progress for the future, to make us ready for the future. I don't want to go through all the individual projects and joint projects, but I think later on in the discussion there is scope for that. Maybe one hint, what we did not do with this package on purpose was to individually accompany individual programs with big measures. You talked about the racking premium or the innovation premium from the automotive sector. On purpose, these details we did not stipulate, but of course for the member states it's possible to individually set up something like that. And these incentives can be set and can be assigned so that individual sectors that are important, especially in member states, and are promoted. Well, I stop here, and I'm looking forward to our joint exchange and discussions. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hago, for your explanations based on the point of view of the Commission. And now we're very excited to hear the opinions of the 5 representatives of the European and Baden-Württemberg economy. Okay, we start with Mr. Kränke, who is joining us online. You are the president of the Baden-Württemberg Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and you represent 650,000 companies. So how about the industry, trade and service companies? What are they feeling like at the moment? Recently, we surveyed many Chamber of Commerce and Industry companies. For 95% of them, demand reclines, and for 79% demand from the EU is negative, and 70% get less orders from outside the European Union, and more than 80% of all parties surveyed have to post enormous decline in sales. So the situation is very hard, and also many companies use the crisis as a chance. Most frequently, companies want to improve demand, want to demand what they can offer and processes, and 1/3 of the companies focus on this, and they need to be supported in the short term. Thank you so much. Now I pass the floor directly to Mr. Reichhold. Mr. Reichhold, you are the president of the Baden-Württemberg Confederation of Skilled Crafts, and you represent around 135,000 craft sector companies. So how strongly are craftsmen and companies affected? Well, Baden-Württemberg craft sector is massively affected, in part, because all these professions cannot work anymore. It's the hairdressers trade, it's the trade show construction, it's the carpenters who work in the environment of events and event technology, and a lot more. The construction trade is doing well. They had their work to do, but all this work, all these orders they posted come from before the coronavirus crisis. And also foreignly acting companies are mostly concerned. Companies working with France, for example, and also commuters from France could not come over the border. And that's an example for all border regions. The Baden-Württemberg craft sector is very strongly acting on export, directly or indirectly. Indirectly via machine manufacturing, where we act as suppliers, or also directly where high quality services from craft trade are really asked for strongly in countries outside Germany, within the European Union, and there were orders we could not fulfill anymore. And of course, these barriers have to be opened again, and also here we need easing for the future. Thank you so much for reporting what the situation is like. Dr. Glaser, you are the president of the Baden-Württemberg Federation of Cooperatives, and you represent cooperative banks, but also commercial cooperative banks. What challenges do your members have at the moment? Please allow me to also say that also a lot of farming cooperatives are part of our federation. It's more than 50 industries organized by cooperatives in our federation, and therefore the challenges are that widespread from the current crisis. Across all industries, and later on I will especially come back to talk about banks. Well, banks post change in demand. In the farming sector has a change in demand. Also the trade sector has a change. And on the one hand, sales slumps are there for cooperatives, but this on the other hand means that cooperative banks, as regionally anchored banks, are in strong demand currently to help the private clients and the company clients, be it to cancel the payment of installments, lending and funding. And for all industries, it will be really fundamental and crucial. And I think this relates to any company represented here today, that from the current crisis, we also have to have perspectives in the companies to be able to start the ramp-up phase and startup phase again. Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask Mr. Schneider a question. You are the president of the Baden-Württemberg Association of Savings Banks, and you represent 51 savings banks in Baden-Württemberg. They're also really strongly challenged at the moment, and the savings banks is one of the most important financing institutions of SMEs. So what is your situation like? Yeah, overnight the customer behavior changed completely. This means our company customers, where the market share is almost 50% as financing group, overnight had this trouble you already described. And here we want to help with most we can do, because we are the financing institution together with the colleagues of the Cooperative Federation. So the first question has been to redeem payment of installments, which we guaranteed in a volume of 1 billion. Of course, we had our immediate credits right away with an increase of 50%, as strong as we've never had before in March and April. And Madam Minister, also in great cooperation with you, with the federal state, with the promotion instruments, funding instruments, we could do all this together, and therefore 1.5 billion of funding credits right away injected into the company. This was incredibly important, and I think our reaction was fast. And I also acknowledge that the economic representatives should really be satisfied with what we did. And we prepared ourselves for this because we knew that good years might also be over one day. And also our equity quota and ratios we have expanded, so that in the last 10 years, we could say, equity was almost doubled. We're strong, and we hope that with these strong partners, we can be a good player in the crisis. Thank you so much. Mr. Toner, you are the chairman of the Association of Baden-Württemberg Banks, and you represent 50 private banks in Baden-Württemberg. What can you tell us? Well, this is not so much different really from what Mr. Glaser has already said, which is a fact because customer segments overlap and intersect. Of course, also our institutions were run over by company clients, SMEs, but also the big companies asking for the preparation and availability of liquidity short term, but also private clients with redemptions and suspension of paying installments, mortgages, they approached us. And I think you take it as a matter of fact, but for the banks, and I'm not speaking on behalf of private banks, but this is of course also true for the other banks, the banks were open, employees were around, in compliance with hygiene regulations in the branches, in the offices. We could serve customers, we could advise customers. Also, we could go on site to be at the customer side and be there for them. And I think beside the preparation, Mr. Schneider explained also the capital side. Also, private banks this time are really clearly part of the solution and not part of the crisis. But of course, we do also know that this is only a beginning. So far, it has been a lot of work, asking for capital, asking for value corrections of private banks, to still have the capacity to provide startup financing, investments that we're talking about here today, so that also this can be rendered. Last but not least, for Baden-Württemberg, also important is the external trade financing, which is the core of private bank activities.
Thank you very much for this status report. Today we talk about a restart for the economy and which strategies would lead us to success. And to the audience now, we would love to hear your opinion, and if you like, you can answer a question on Mentimeter. And later on, we are going to look at that together. The question is, how do you rate the EU activities that have been taken so far to combat the COVID-19 crisis? And now we get back to Mr. Hager. Mr. Hager, we heard about the situation in the companies, and we heard about some first ideas about what is necessary now. And we are now interested in what are the next steps. Many companies have received emergency aids, but how do they continue now? And the question on funding was also very important in the questions we received from the audience. How does the EU support companies during the restart of the economy? Mr. Hager, perhaps you can give us your statement. Well, I talked about it earlier on already. What we need is the right mix from the states that are in a position to do that, and on the other hand, the support measures from the European Union. And I had already mentioned it earlier on. The member states have very different starting positions, and what is currently being achieved in Germany is rather impressive. However, we cannot expect that also from the other member states. To be able to maintain this common playing field, we need to provide funding to guarantee liquidity. But this can only be the first step. I also talked about our banks package, where we also provided support to the banks for the equity requirements so that the buffers can be reduced a bit, but these are all temporarily important measures. But then we have to take it a step further. And the step further has been done with the package that we presented yesterday. For example, one new measure is a solvency support instrument. This means companies who are now in this really difficult position and insolvency is threatening can apply for this, and we'll provide the guarantee, and via investment funds we make sure that the funds get to these companies. If you look at the entire package, then for almost all sectors and areas, interesting instruments are provided. And the most important thing is that we get this going now. So we need an agreement on the funding scope and the package as such. But what we can't accept is a delay or a gap which would lead to the effect that we don't want to see. We need to guarantee that everything runs smoothly. We have done that with the direct measures and activities, and now we have to see that this funding package will be ready very soon so that we can get things running, and from that we can then approve these funds from the 1st of January 2021. Now, focus recovery. I'm quite interested in the opinions that we see here in the federal state. So, what is most important? And I would like to start with you, Madam Minister. Well, from the point of view of Baden-Württemberg, it is very important that the recovery package sees the German Mittelstand playing a major role, so that they can now unfold their innovation power, because we see the opportunity that the economy can be further developed. Now, my question is, to which extent the recovery measures of this package are aligned to the SMEs? And then it would be one of my wishes that this recovery plan would work. It is limited in time, but I would like to know how long this will give us a perspective. The COVID-19 crisis requires that we have quite a longer period of time to support our economy. In Baden-Württemberg, we are currently also planning a joint fund, and we need the means to support our companies. So you said it's a temporary framework. Can you already assess on how long this will help. Mr. Hager, you already talked about the timeline of the recovery packages. You said it should be part of the multi-annual framework. Germany will take over the presidency in the Council, which is a major task. And will this recovery framework only become active then? And will the money be only available at that time? Because it would be of benefit for us in our planning to know about this. Of course, it's very important that this is linking the instruments on a regional level, on the federal and on the state level. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this. Thank you. That was a clear statement in favor of the SMEs. And a few questions to Mr. Hager. We're still collecting, and then Mr. Hager, after this I will give the floor to you. But first of all, Mr. Kränke, could you tell us what your major concern is, what you expect? Well, now I don't only think about employees of companies here in the federal state. As Mrs. Hoffmeister-Kraut already said, the economy consists to a large part of SMEs, so they have the economic power, so they are the foundation of our economy. And of course we also have to discuss about which investments and loans are to be used to support these SMEs. I think the current suggestions and ideas are already pointing in the right direction. And about the volume, we have only heard about this yesterday. Digitalization, climate protection, these are of course the most important issues we have to tackle, and Mr. Hager had already pointed out that we will have to look into this. Of course, there are also structural issues. Perhaps it is possible to link the recovery fund with already existing programs like Horizon Europe or structural program like ESF. And this way, it is perhaps possible to have a faster cash flow. And I think you can also pick out a few downsides in this. Mr. Reichhold, what does the craft sector need? What would you like to see? Well, our 133 companies in Baden-Württemberg are the backbone of the economy, and we are the guarantor of jobs. So I hope and I believe that we can keep all these people. But of course we need an economic framework that allows us to do this. And this includes, of course, the support of our key industries. We are part of the development. If they're doing well, then craft sector is also doing well. But for our export-oriented companies, we also need to provide access to the European markets. This means open borders, hopefully soon, and the possibility to be able to work faster and in a simpler way. We need to make sure that national states stop hampering letting people travel into their countries. This will all take too much time. We have to open the market and we have to make sure that we can work in the other EU neighboring countries, and of course they also in Germany. And if this works out, we can create a broad base in Baden-Württemberg, and we can use this correctly in Baden-Württemberg. Thank you very much. We heard so much about the German Mittelstand now. And I would also like to thank the audience for posting questions. 250 people are watching via YouTube and Facebook, and one of the most important questions was, how will the restart of the economy be funded? And that's why we are going to look at you, Dr. Glaser, Dr. Schneider, and Mr. Torner. So what are your concerns as the financing parties of the German Mittelstand? Let's start with Dr. Glaser. What are the concerns of the cooperative banks? I would say with the cooperative banks, it's similar than with the other banks. They see their function in financing their private and commercial customers, and they need to be able to do that. What is it that I want to say by this? We showed you early on that we have a huge loan business, and from the equity requirements and the regulatory requirements, we have to make sure that we can guarantee that the bank can grant loans, also in the long term. As we can see today, the crisis has no date before it's over, so we have to look at a time frame, and reasonably we need to define how loans are granted. The regulations have been made stricter after the crisis in 2008 and 2009. However, today we have to seriously discuss about what has helped and what has made it worse. We have to reduce regulations, and here we hope that we get into a good dialogue with the European institutions because it will be vital for the national states. I pass the floor to Mr. Schneider. What is your major concern, and what is the best contribution the EU can bring? Well, we were confronted with enormous costs, and we know that the EU institutions are not very familiar with our three-part banking system. Mr. Hager is from Germany, he knows these things. But Mr. Hager, you said something earlier on. You said a temporary ease of regulations. This is a pain for us. It doesn't help to have a temporary aid. It must be long-term. In the crisis, I mean, what can I think of an advisory board if they have to stop things right in the first week? It's over-regulated, so we have to really talk about these things. Of course, we need regulations, and the advisory board has to get into a debate to discuss it. We cannot just say after the crisis everything will be different than before, but in terms of advisory it will be all the same. We have regulatory costs which I can prove to you in detail, and we need to reduce these costs to be strong and fit for the future so that we can play that in the long term. Thank you. And now I pass the floor to Mr. Torner. So what is your most pressing need? Thank you, Mr. Hager. I think you are not surprised. At least one of us is going to talk about the bank levies. And I know that you have heard from other colleagues already. Nevertheless, I still want to mention it again, especially in the context of the crisis. Now that we are in the recovery stage, in a stage where companies want to invest and we have to process value adjustments, the equity buffers are now, of course, a lot higher. And this morning we already discussed it. It will still be necessary that the banks will get investments in terms of, or will finance investments, and it might look counterproductive that capital is taken off the banks now. In 2019, we paid around 2 billion in bank levies, and this has been increased by 20 to 30%. So if the actual bank levy exceeds the point of return, whether we can then talk about the amount. And there's also the question of tax deductibility. For us, it's very hard to comprehend, especially if you have a European view on it. In Germany, we are kind of in a unique position because we cannot deduct it from tax. And to pay this tax levy, we need to get a lot of profit, and that at times where we have low interests, and these 900 million then transformed will be around 500 million equity, and to provide this to the economy is something that we would like to see, and we would be happy if you could support us in this sector, because this would immediately and directly help our SMEs in the region. Thank you. Now we've heard a lot about different suggestions that would help, and I'm interested in how the audience sees the activities during the COVID-19 crisis. So let's have a look. Here we can see the image of Mentimeter. Now it works. We can see whether there's still room to improve or whether it's already very good. We see it's a mixed picture depending on from where people are watching. All in all, we see around 60% of the German-speaking audience who are more on the positive side and gave us a positive feedback. The English-speaking audience has a more critical view, so it's quite a mixed picture. There is still room to improve. And with all these questions and needs from Baden-Württemberg, I would like to pass the floor to you again, Mr. Hager. So what are you doing? What are the next steps? Thank you. Well, of course, that is a bit bouquet of flowers in terms of the wishes that are now passed on to Brussels. First of all, I would like to say that the SMEs are in our focus. The individual programs and projects that are part of this framework we presented yesterday are, of course, help for the SMEs. Then, of course, the SMEs will have to implement this in programs. We are not specifying that only SMEs will be funded or only large companies will be funded, but it depends on how the need is in the different member states. Think small first is something that we really take seriously, and we underline this with this package. Now, of course, this ease is important right now, but this can't be a long-term measure. We also have a look at national spending and what this does to the overall finance architecture. We have states of debts in some member states which are already quite hard to overcome, and to let loose completely would have severe impact. Of course, a framework of aid that is temporarily granted till the end of the year, this is one thing. Of course, we can also check that again, and we might be speaking of a second wave, so perhaps it would be necessary to expand it, but right now it is limited for this year, till the end of this year. Another issue we touched on is how fast the money flows. our legislative technique is perhaps not always helpful. What we've seen in terms of the support framework of the European Investment Bank, the negotiations have taken until the day before yesterday. Now the framework is in place, but the scope of time is a long one. There are democratic processes. Of course, we see difficulties also during the crisis to go through all the different voting processes. And this takes me right to the point of the multi-annual financial framework. The recovery instrument is clearly linked to the multi-annual program. Getting the funding done will only be possible when the next framework is in place and has been ratified by the different member states. And now I would say to the member states, it's in your own interest to negotiate that now fast and present it. 2020 is not over yet, but the start of the next financial framework is still far away. And we need to bridge the gap. We have to make sure that it will also work now. So we have already provided funding for the second half of the year. And a part of the package that was presented yesterday is that new funding is provided also this year. So the member states are required to provide the support that is necessary. Now, when I hear all the different concerns of the banking sector, I can understand it really well. After the last crisis, the banks were not part of the solution, but part of the crisis. And this led to the fact that the regulatory measures were made stricter. Of course, we have to see where we can ease it, but we mustn't forget, if we look across the European Union, then not all banks are in a good position across the EU. And if I look at the bank levy, we put that to the test. The bank levy is not something that is only in our budget and disappears there. But the target is to fill the processing fund to be able to have the means and funding to guarantee that banks remain in business. And I can see that we can use this money in a better way, but the interest of the member states in this was almost close to zero. So we did not receive support from all the different sides, and not everybody has voiced this wish, and that's why I think it will be really difficult to get this done. Now, my last point, if I look at the equity demands, at the end of this year, we will come up with the modified Basel III, and of course, we will include the lessons learned. It's not only checking whether the framework of Basel is still adequate, but to check whether it matches the lessons we learned during this crisis. At the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that the authorities also have their ideas, and they are not very eager to loosen the regulations. So striking a balance will be most important. Thank you very much for this insight. Our public stream is now almost over, but please still stay in the line. And for the closing, I look at you again, Mrs. Hoffmeister-Kraut. This was our second session during the Economic Summit, and my question is, what do you take home with you? Well, today we discussed many inspiring ideas and programs that have been put in place already, we clearly phrased what we expect. In a joint effort, we have to get the European economy going again, so that is the target we pursue together. I see this crisis also as an opportunity, and I think at that state we should really grasp it as that, and we must use the opportunities out of it. I'm convinced if we are now setting the course together, the federal state, the national level and the European level, then we will be stronger after the crisis. We have seen what wealth and employment means, that we cannot take it for granted. We are still right in the middle in this fragile, uncertain situation. Employment and wealth needs hard work, and that's why it will be crucial how we are tackling the recovery. First of all, we have to provide the financial funds to the company to overcome the crisis, because we need every single one of them to take part in this recovery. We need to support the companies to drive the transformation processes, the large ones in mobility and sustainability. The companies need to master those, and we need to support them with the right instruments. My plea is now how exactly the companies fulfill these goals and which course they take is something we need to leave to the companies, the creative heads in these companies. And I would like to ask the European Union to leave scope for development and not create small-scale regulations that burden the economy even more. Mr. Hager, I would like to thank you also on behalf of my team and the other panel discussion participants, and you have a lot of influence on the decisions that are made on European level, and that's why it's very valuable for us to exchange our ideas with you and present our suggestions, although you know the south of Germany, and I hope that you're still closely linked to us. Nevertheless, I believe it is important that we enter an exchange on a regular basis, and we'd be very pleased if we could get in touch from time to time. Already at my statement in the beginning, I made it clear we can only be successful together with the European Union. The national states alone will not manage it. That's my conviction, and therefore we need this important balance of the instruments and agreement in politics. Of course, I see that we are facing challenges, but the COVID-19 crisis can be a huge opportunity for Europe as well. Thank you very much indeed to everybody, also to the audience in the live stream. Now I'm looking forward to tomorrow and the 2 sessions that we're going to run then. And I believe it became clear it's important to enter into a discussion and exchange our arguments and ideas, because only if we work in the same direction we'll have success.